Ink stained her index finger, a brilliant, bruising cobalt against pale skin. She didn't weep. She didn't scream. She simply pressed the brass nib to the heavy vellum and dissolved 3 years of a suffocating marriage. Outside, rain lashed against the leaded glass of the solicitor's office. Inside, Arthur watched her, his jaw tight, waiting for the hysterical breakdown that never came. He thought he was discarding a broken plaything. He didn't realize he had just unlatched a cage. Dust motes danced in the anemic light, filtering through the solicitor's frosted window. It smelled of ancient paper, sealing wax, and the distinct sour odor of nervous sweat. Mr. Anathy, the solicitor, was sweating. Nora was not. She sat rigidly in the leather wingback chair, the horsehair stuffing pressing uncomfortably through the thin silk of her skirts. Her lungs felt shallow, restricted not by the woven corset she wore, but by the sheer crushing weight of the silence in the room. Across the mahogany expanse of the desk sat Arthur, Duke of Somerset, her husband. Well, her husband for another 3 minutes. Arthur's signet ring, heavy gold bearing a snarling bore, tapped a rhythmic, agonizing tempo against the polished wood. Click, click, click. It was the sound he made when a horse disappointed him. It was the sound he made when a servant spilled the clar. It was the sound he had made every time she walked into a room for the past 6 months. "Sign here, Your Grace," Mr. Anathy murmured, his voice cracking. He pushed the document across the desk. The paper was thick, creamy, edges sharp enough to draw blood. Nora stared at the black letters, null and void, irreconcilable differences, annulment. The legal jargon stripped away 3 years of shared breaths in the dark, of whispered confessions, of the sudden, freezing realization that she was entirely alone in a crowded ballroom. It reduced her to ink. Arthur cleared his throat. A dry scraping sound. "You will be provided for, Nora. The stipend is generous, more than generous for a woman returning to, well, to nothing." His tone was magnanimous. It dripped with the kind of practiced pity men reserve for wounded birds. "They've shot themselves." He wanted her to look up. He wanted her eyes to brim with tears. He wanted the validation of her grief to warm him against the coldness of his own decision. She didn't give it to him. Nora picked up the fountain pen. The brass was cold. She noticed a slight tremor in her wrist, not from sorrow, but from a sudden fierce spike of adrenaline, like a fox smelling the open field. She pressed the nib to the line. It scratched a loud, ugly tearing sound in the quiet room. Eleanor Margaret Hayes. She signed her maiden name, a small petty rebellion that made the solicitor flinch. No tears came. She waited for the phantom ache in her chest, the weeping she had rehearsed in the dark canopy of her bed for weeks. Nothing, just an expansive, echoing hollowness. It was terrifyingly peaceful. She set the pen down. It rolled slightly, clinking against the crystal inkwell. "Done," she said. Her voice was raspy, unused. Arthur stopped tapping his ring. The silence stretched taut and vibrating. He leaned forward, the smell of his bay rum cologne washing over the desk, mixing sickeningly with the dust. "Just like that, Nora. No scene, no begging. I expected more fire from you." "Fire requires air, Arthur," she replied, standing up. Her knees locked. The blood rushed from her head, leaving black spots dancing in her vision. But she dug her nails into her palms until the sharp pain grounded her. "You took all the oxygen from the room years ago." She didn't look at his face. If she looked at his eyes, those pale, flinty eyes that had once looked at her with something resembling hunger, she might fracture. She couldn't afford a fracture. She unpinned the heavy diamond brooch from her collar, the Somerset heirloom that felt like a stone around her neck, and placed it next to the contract. Then she turned and walked out. The heavy oak door shut behind her with a dull final thud. In the hallway, the air was instantly colder. Nora leaned against the flocked wallpaper, closing her eyes. She expected to feel light. Instead, she leaned over and dry heaved into her handkerchief, her stomach violently protesting the sheer unnatural tension of the last hour. She wiped her mouth, tasting bitter bile and tin. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't a triumph. It was just survival. Packing took less than 2 hours. It was alarming, really, how little space a woman occupied when you stripped away a man's money. The Somerset London townhouse was a cavern of velvet, gilt, and oppressive mahogany. Nora walked through the bedroom she had shared with Arthur, her boots clicking softly on the Persian rug. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, giving the room a smell of woods and old lavender. Her maid, Clara, was weeping softly over an open leather trunk, folding a modest wool travelling gown. "Please stop, Clara. The moisture will ruin the wool," Nora said, her voice sounding detached, as if echoing from the end of a long tunnel. "But ma'am," Clara sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, a thoroughly unladylike gesture that Nora usually corrected. Today she didn't care. "It ain't right. Cast out like this. Where will you go? How will you live?" "I am not cast out. I walked out. There is a difference." Nora picked up a silver-backed hairbrush. Arthur had given it to her on their first anniversary. She stared at her reflection in the handle's mirror. Her skin was shallow. Her dark hair pulled back too tightly, accentuating the sharp angles of her cheekbones. She looked older than 24. She looked weathered. She tossed the brush into the waste bin. It hit the bottom with a loud clatter. Clara gasped. "Only what I brought with me," Nora instructed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. A dull, throbbing headache had taken root behind her right eye. No jewels, no furs, nothing bought with Somerset coin. Downstairs, Arthur was in his study. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was pouring his second glass of brandy. He was sitting in the maroon leather chair, legs stretched toward the fire, waiting. He fully expected her to come down, to knock softly on the panel door, to throw herself at his knees and beg for a rehearsal, or at least a tearful goodbye. He thrived on theatrics. He consumed her emotions like a glutton. Clear's throat, she wouldn't feed him today. Nora fastened the buttons of her dark grey coat. The fabric was stiff, smelling faintly of mothballs. She pulled on her gloves. The leather was supple, yet it felt like armor. "Have the footman bring the trunk to the carriage," Nora said. She walked down the grand sweeping staircase for the last time. Her hand trailed along the polished oak banister. She remembered the day she arrived here as a bride, feeling like she had conquered the world. Now she realized she had only been a trophy placed on a very high, very cold shelf. She passed the study. The door was ajar. A thin wedge of yellow light spilled onto the marble floor. She could smell the brandy. She could hear the rustle of a newspaper. He was pretending to read. Nora didn't pause. She didn't break her stride. Her boots tapped a steady, even rhythm across the marble. Tap, tap, tap. A perfect unbothered cadence. She reached the heavy front door. The butler, Hodges, stood rigidly, his face an unreadable mask, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Piety, perhaps. He opened the door. The damp London air rushed in, smelling of wet cobblestones, coal smoke, and raw cabbage from a nearby market. It was an ugly smell. It was the best thing she had ever smelled. "Goodbye, Hodges," she said quietly. "Safe travels, madam," he whispered. She stepped out into the fog. The rented hackney carriage was waiting, the horse blowing plumes of steam into the chilly afternoon. Nora climbed inside. The seats were cracked leather, smelling of stale tobacco and damp straw. It wasn't the plush velvet of the Duke's carriage. It jolted violently as the driver whipped the horse. As they pulled away, Nora looked back through the smeared glass of the window. The front door of the townhouse was still open. Arthur stood on the threshold. He looked smaller from this distance. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't smiling. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dark, confused shadow. Nora turned away, facing forward. She leaned her head against the cold glass. The headache pounded. Her stomach churned. She was terrified, entirely unsure of how she would pay for coal next month. But as the carriage rattled over the rough stones, jarring her bones, the iron band around her chest finally snapped. She took a deep, shuddering breath. It hurt. It felt magnificent. 4 weeks later, the frost came. Nora's cottage in Hampshire was small, draughty, and smelled perpetually of damp earth and burning peat. The floorboards in the kitchen sagged near the sink, and the wind off the moor rattled the thin window panes like a restless ghost. She sat at the small pine table, wrapping her hands around a chipped mug of tea. The tea was cheap, bitter on her tongue, and lacked the bergamot aroma she was used to. She took a sip and let the scalding liquid burn a path down her throat. Her fingernails were short now, without Clara to manicure them. They had chipped and a small blister had formed on her thumb from chopping kindling the day before. She rubbed the blister thoughtfully. It was a tangible proof of existence. In Arthur's house, she had been a ghost, a porcelain doll positioned by the window. Here she chopped wood. She made bitter tea. She existed. The silence of the cottage was absolute. At first, it had been maddening. She would wake in the middle of the night, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting to hear Arthur's heavy, demanding footsteps on the stairs, expecting his booming voice criticizing the dust on the mantel or the arrangement of the flowers. Now, this silence was a blanket. She spent hours reading old battered novels bought for pennies from the village market. She walked on the moors until her hem was soaked with freezing mud and her cheeks were raw from the wind. She was lonely, yes. Sometimes the loneliness rose in her throat like bile. A sudden sharp panic about dying, forgotten in this drafty box. But the panic always faded, replaced by a stubborn, gritty relief. Meanwhile, back in London, the silence was suffocating Arthur alive. He sat in the massive dining room of the townhouse, a room designed for 40 people, eating roast pheasant alone. The clatter of his silver fork against the china echoed off the vaulted ceiling. He had expected her to fail. He had waited for the letter. "Arthur, please. I have made a terrible mistake. I have nothing." He had kept the stipend account open on his desk, checking it daily, waiting for her to draw from it. She hadn't touched a single penny. "Hodges," Arthur barked, tossing his napkin onto the table. The butler appeared silently from the shadows. "Your Grace, why is this house so damn quiet?" "Is the staff dead?" "No, Your Grace. We are simply endeavoring not to disturb you." Arthur scowled, pushing his chair back. It scraped loudly against the floorboards. He walked out of the dining room and wandered into the drawing room. He hadn't been in here since Nora left. It was her room. The fire was unlit. The air felt stale, smelling faintly of lemon polish and dust. He walked over to the pianoforte in the corner. He ran a finger over the closed lid. It came back clean, but the instrument looked abandoned. He moved to the small writing desk by the window. He yanked open the top drawer, not knowing what he was looking for. A forgotten letter, a sign that she had cared. The drawer was empty, save for a single forgotten object wedged in the back corner. He reached in and pulled it out. It was a silver hairpin, small, tarnished. Arthur stared at it in his massive palm. Suddenly, a phantom scent hit him. Not the heavy floral perfumes of his mistresses, but Nora, bergamot, clean linen, and something sharp like rain on hot stone. A sudden, violent twist of nausea clamped onto his stomach. She was gone. Really gone. The woman who had endured his moods, arranged his life, anchored his chaotic, arrogant existence in quiet dignity. She had walked out without a tear, and the hollow space she left behind was eating him from the inside out. He crushed the hairpin in his fist, the metal digging painfully into his skin. "Hodges," he roared, the sound tearing through the silent house. The butler appeared at the door. "Have the carriage brought round, the closed one, and tell the driver to prepare for a long journey. We are going to Hampshire." The knock came just as Nora was wiping down the pine table. It wasn't a polite tap. It was heavy, rhythmic, and demanding. It rattled the cheap brass latch on her front door. Bang! 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 Nora froze. The damp rag in her hand dripping a single drop of grey water onto the floorboards. Her pulse spiked. A sudden, deafening drum beat in her ears. She knew that knock. She would know it if she lived to be 100. For a wild second, the old instincts flared. Check your hair. Smooth your skirts. Apologize for the mess. Her hand twitched toward her messy pinned-up braids. Then she stopped. She lowered her hand. She looked down at her faded, rough-spun skirt. She looked at the blister on her thumb. The knocking came again, louder this time. "Nora, open the door." Arthur's voice, muffled by the thick oak, sounded impatient, carrying the unearned authority of a man who owned everything he surveyed. She walked slowly to the small window beside the door and peeked through the curtain. It was raining again. Arthur stood on her small muddy stoop. He was wearing a heavy, expensive woolen greatcoat, but he had no umbrella. The rain plastered his usually immaculate blonde hair to his forehead. Mud spattered his polished Hessens. He looked furious, desperate, and entirely out of place in her bleak grey world. He raised his gloved fist to pound again. Nora let the curtain drop. She didn't run to the door. She didn't shoot the bolt open. She simply walked back to the kitchen, picked up the kettle, and placed it on the stove. Let him stand in the rain. Let him ruin his boots. She had a cup of tea to make. Rain drove against the cottage in relentless sweeping sheets, masking the sound of Arthur's fists against the door. Inside, Nora stood paralyzed by the stove. Her right hand hovered over the box of matches. It shook. Fine, humiliating tremor ran from her wrist up to her shoulder. It was the phantom limb of her obedience. For 3 years, a raised voice from Arthur meant she moved. She smoothed. She placated. She poured the tea. She smiled, the thin, tight smile of a woman shrinking herself to fit a man's temper. The urge to unbolt the door and apologize for the rain was a sickness deep in her marrow. Bang! 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 Nora! His voice was a dull roar through the wet oak. It did not sound like the booming, commanding baritone that echoed through the halls of the Somerset estate. The wind shredded the sound, leaving it thin and slightly desperate. Nora gritted her teeth, the muscles in her jaw popping. She struck the match. The sharp acrid scent of sulphur flared in the damp kitchen, cutting through the smell of wet earth. She touched the flame to the dry kindling under the kettle. The wood caught with a soft, crackling sigh. She forced herself to sit at the small pine table. She placed her hands flat on the rough wood, anchoring herself to the present, to this house, her house. Outside, Arthur lowered his bruised fist. The skin over his knuckles was scraped raw from the rough grain of the wood, the blood mixing with the freezing rain. He stared at the brass latch, utterly bewildered. She was in there. He had seen the curtain twitch. He knew she had seen him. A cold droplet of water slid down the bridge of his nose and hung from the tip before dropping onto his cravat. His 200 lb bespoke woolen greatcoat, tailored to emphasize the broadness of his shoulders, was rapidly becoming a sodden lean weight. The freezing mud of the stoop was seeping through the fine leather of his Hessian boots, chilling his toes to the bone. He waited. He counted to 10. The door did not open. Arthur took a step back, the wind nearly knocking him off balance. He looked around the desolate grey expanse of the Hampshire moors. There was no carriage waiting to whisk him away. He had ordered his driver to wait at the village in 2 miles back, arrogant enough to assume he would simply walk into Nora's pathetic little vale, deliver his pardon, and whisk her back to London before nightfall. He was the Duke of Somerset. Doors opened for him often before he even reached them. Footmen bowed, women curtsed, solicitors sweated. He did not stand in the mud. He did not wait. "Elanena," he barked, stepping forward to rattle the latch. It didn't yield. The metal was freezing against his bare palm. He had taken his right glove off to knock louder. Inside, the kettle began to whistle a low, ready pitch. Nora stood up slowly, her knees stiff. She poured the boiling water into a chipped earthenware teapot. The steam rose, warming her face, smelling faintly of cheap, earthy tea leaves. It was not the delicate Darjeeling she used to pour for him in cups of eggshell porcelain. She picked up her cup, walked back to the table, and pulled a wicker mending basket toward her. She drew out a grey woolen stocking and a bone needle. "Nora, this is absurd. Open this door immediately." "I am soaking wet." His voice was closer now. He was leaning against the wood. She could hear the heavy, wet squelch of his boots shifting on the stones. Nora threaded the needle. She didn't look at the door. Her heart was hammering a frantic, sickening rhythm against her ribs, but her hands had finally stopped shaking. I know you can hear me, Arthur said, his tone dropping from a command to a harsh, tight hiss. Do not play these childish games. You have made your point. You are angry. Fine, I concede the point. Now open the damn door before I catch pneumonia. I concede the point. Nora paused, the needle halfway through the wall. He thought this was a negotiation. He thought she was a sulking child holding her breath until she got a sweeter piece of candy. He truly believed the annulment was a theatrical ploy to garner his attention. The sheer suffocating arrogance of it settled over her like a heavy blanket. She stood up, walked quietly to the door, and pressed her cheek against the cold, damp wood. The Duke of Somerset does not reside here, she said. Her voice was not loud, but the wood carried the vibration of her words perfectly. It was flat, completely devoid of emotion. Outside, Arthur recoiled as if the door had burned him. He stared at the wood, his chest heaving under the wet wool. Nora, he said, his voice dropping, the anger entirely eclipsed by shock. You have the wrong house, Your Grace. There is no one here by the name of Somerset. I suggest you seek shelter in the village. It is a 2-mile walk east. Nora, open the door. This isn't funny. It isn't a joke, Arthur. It is a legal fact. You signed it yourself. She stepped back from the door. She walked back to her tea, sat down, and picked up her mending. She took a slow, deliberate sip from the chipped mug. On the stoop, Arthur grabbed the handle with both hands and wrenched it viciously. The heavy iron bolt on the inside clattered, holding fast. He slammed his shoulder against the oak. It felt like hitting a solid wall of stone. Pain flared through his collarbone, sharp and bright. He stumbled backward into the rain, gasping. The wind whipped his wet hair across his eyes. He looked at the small, dark windows of the cottage. The pale yellow glow of a single oil lamp flickered in the kitchen, utterly indifferent to the storm outside. He was locked out. The realization hit him with the physical force of a blow to the stomach. Arthur wrapped his arms around his shivering torso. The chill was no longer just in his boots. It was creeping up his legs, settling into his chest. For the first time in his 30 years of life, a terrifying, entirely alien sensation washed over him. He was powerless. By 8:00, the rain had turned to sleep. The sound changed from a heavy drumming to a sharp, aggressive clicking against the glass, like a handful of gravel being thrown repeatedly at the window panes. The temperature in the cottage had plummeted. Nora sat in the wing-back chair by the small hearth, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, a book resting unread in her lap. She had not heard a sound from the stoop in nearly 2 hours. She stared into glowing peat fire. The logical part of her brain, the cynical part that had survived the Duke of Somerset, told her he had walked back to the village. Arthur was a creature of intense physical comfort. He would not endure freezing sleep out of sheer stubbornness. He would have marched back to the inn, demanded a hot bath, and cursed her name over a glass of expensive brandy, but a knot of unease tightened in her gut. The moors were treacherous in the dark. There were bogs, sudden drops, and the wind was disorienting. He didn't know the terrain. He had grown up on paved streets and manicured lawns. Nora closed her eyes and rubbed her temples. He is not your responsibility, she told herself. He ceased to be your responsibility the moment Mr. Anathy blotted the ink. Yet leaving a husband was an act of survival. Leaving a man to die of exposure on her doorstep was an act of cruelty she wasn't sure she could live with. She was angry, resentful, and exhausted, but she was not a murderer. She set the book down. The floorboards creaked as she stood. She picked up the oil lamp from the mantel, the glass chimney warm against her palm, and walked slowly into the narrow entryway. The air here was freezing, seeping through the cracks around the door frame. She held her breath and listened. Over the howling of the wind and the hiss of the sleet, she heard it, a ragged shuddering intake of breath, then a heavy scrape against the wood as if a large animal was shifting its weight against the bottom of the door. He hadn't left. Nora felt a sudden sharp spike of anger. He was forcing her hand. Even in defeat, he was demanding her attention, forcing her to the one to break, to yield, to care. She set the lamp on the small side table. She reached out and wrapped her hand around the heavy iron bolt. It was freezing. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her knuckles white. Then, with a harsh metallic clack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet cottage, she threw the bolt back. She turned the handle and pulled the door inward just 3 in. The wind shrieked instantly, blowing out the flame of the oil lamp, plunged into shadows. Nora braced her shoulder against the door to keep it from being torn open by the gale. Arthur was sitting on the tiny stone bench next to the door. He did not look like a duke. He was a dark, sodden mass of wall and mud. His knees were pulled up to his chest, his arms wrapped tightly around them. He was shivering so violently that the heavy bench vibrated against the stone stoop. When the door opened, he lifted his head. The faint grey light from the sleet-covered moon illuminated his face. His skin was an ashen translucent white. His lips were visibly blue, cracked at the corners. His hair, usually a perfect, arrogant sweep of gold, was plussed to his skull, dark with freezing water. He looked up at her through the 3-in crack. His eyes, usually sharp and flinty, were glazed and wide with a raw primal misery. He opened his mouth to speak, but his teeth chattered so hard they audibly clicked together, a pathetic clicking sound. "Are you quite finished trying to prove a point?" Nora asked. Her voice was entirely steady, though her stomach recoiled at the sight of him. Arthur tried to stand. His legs, cramped and frozen from hours on the stone, refused to hold his weight. He stumbled forward, his heavy, wet shoulder hitting the doorframe with a dull thud. He grasped the edge of the open door, his fingers white, stiff and clumsy. "Nora," he breathed. The word barely had any sound. It was just a rush of freezing air. Let me in. I told you to go to the village." "Couldn't," he stammered, his chin trembling uncontrollably. "Too dark. Didn't know the way." He tried to push the door wider. Nora didn't budge. She locked her elbow, using her hip to brace the heavy oak. She was stronger than she looked, and he was currently weaker than a child. "Please," he whispered. The word hung in the freezing air between them. Please. It was a foreign word in Arthur's vocabulary. He had never used it with her. Not when he wanted her in his bed, not when he wanted her to handle his mother, not when he demanded she overlook his indiscretions. He had commanded, he had expected, he had never pleaded. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a realization of his sins. It was just the desperate instinctual begging of an animal seeking a fire. Nora stared at his blue lips. The anger in her chest curled into a cold, heavy disgust. The terrifying, towering figure of her nightmares was just a man, a foolish, stubborn, fragile man in a ruined coat. She stepped back, pulling the door open just enough for him to pass. "Get inside," she snapped. Arthur lunged forward, stumbling over the threshold. He practically fell into the tiny moodroom, his wet boots sliding on the slate floor. He caught himself against the wall, leaving a streak of dark mud on the whitewashed plaster. Nora slammed the door shut behind him and threw the bolt home. The sudden silence in the entryway was deafening, broken only by the sound of Arthur's ragged, wet breathing and the drip of water pooling around his boots. He leaned against the wall, eyes closed, swaying slightly. He expected her to touch him. He expected the rush of her hands, the anxious fussing he was accustomed to. He waited for her to take his coat, to guide him to the fire, to pour him brandy. Nora did none of those things. She walked past him, opened a small wooden chest in the corner, and pulled out a coarse, scratchy blanket woven from raw sheep's wool. It smelled heavily of lanolin and dust. She tossed it at him. It hit his chest, and he fumbled to catch it with numb fingers. "Take those boots off before you track more mud onto my floor," she said, her tone the exact one she used when scolding a stray dog that had wandered into the kitchen, "and leave that ruined coat on the peg. You are not coming into the parlor dripping lake water." Arthur stared at her, the rough blanket clutched in his trembling hands. The water dripped from his nose. He looked past her, seeing the warm orange glow of the fire in the next room. He took a step forward. Nora stepped into the doorway, blocking his path entirely. Her posture was rigid, her dark eyes flashing with a cold, hard light he had never seen before. "I said," she repeated, enunciating every syllable with chilling precision. "Take off your boots. You are a guest in this house, Arthur, and barely a welcome one. You will follow my rules, or you can take your chances on the moor." Arthur looked down at her. He was taller than her by nearly a foot, but standing there in his sodden, freezing clothes, dripping onto the slate floor, he had never felt so impossibly small. He slowly reached down to unbuckle his boots, mud squelched sickeningly as Arthur yanked at the heel of his left boot. The wet leather had swollen, clinging to his calf like a second freezing skin. He grunted a harsh animal sound that echoed off the cramped walls of the mudroom. His fingers, stiff and blue-white, lacked the strength to grip the slippery heel. He slipped, his shoulder knocking heavily against the plaster. Nora stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her arms crossed over her chest. She watched him. In London, a footman would have knelt in the dirt, carefully easing the boot off while Arthur stared absently over his head, perhaps sipping a brandy. Here, there were no footmen. There was only the harsh draft whistling under the door, and a woman who refused to bridge the gap. He pulled again, his breath hitching in a wet, ragged gasp. The boot finally gave way with a loud pop, releasing a flood of freezing muddy water onto the slate tiles. Arthur slumped back against the wall, punting, staring at his ruined sodden stocking. "The other one," Nora said flatly. He didn't argue. He couldn't. The cold had penetrated his bones, leaving his jaw rigid and his mind sluggish. When the second boot was off, he stood in a puddle of his own making, shivering so violently his teeth clicked in a rapid, erratic rhythm. He reached for the buttons of his great coat. His numb fingers fumbled uselessly against the heavy horn toggles. He tried 3 times, failing to slip a single button through its hole. A surge of pathetic, impotent frustration tightened his throat. He looked up at Nora, his eyes rimmed with red, begged her silently, "Help me. Do this for me." Nora held his gaze. She saw the tremor in his hands, the utter, helpless confusion of a man who had never dressed or undressed himself without assistance since childhood. A ghost of her old conditioning flared. An urge to step forward, to brush his wet hands aside, to efficiently strip away the ruined wool and drape him in something warm. It would be so easy to fall back into the rhythm of being useful to him. She dug her nails into her forearms, grounding herself in the sharp pinch of pain. "Take it off, Arthur," she commanded, her voice low and uncompromising. "You will not drag that wet wool into my parlor." He blinked. A flash of genuine shock registering through the fog of his hypothermia. Then the shock melted into a sullen, desperate compliance. He bit his own leather glove, dragging it off his hand with his teeth. He used his bare, shaking fingers to brutally wrench the buttons of his coat through the holes, tearing one of the toggles clean off. It hit the slate floor with a sharp clatter. The heavy great coat slid from his shoulders, landing on the floor with a wet, heavy slap. Beneath it, his tailored superfine jacket was stained dark with rain, his pristine linen cravat reduced to a damp grey rag. Nora turned and walked into the parlor. She opened the battered wooden trunk sitting at the foot of the small sofa. It held the meager belongings the cottage's previous tenant, a retired shepherd, had left behind. She pulled out a pair of coarse homespun trousers smelling strongly of wood smoke and sheep, and a thick oversized flannel shirt. The fabric was rough enough to exfoliate skin permanently stained at the elbows. She walked back to the mood room and tossed the bundle onto the small bench. "Change into these. Hang your wet things on the pegs," she instructed, pointing to the row of iron hooks near the door. "When you are decent, you may come sit by the fire." She didn't wait for his response. She walked back into the parlor, picked up the iron poker, and viciously stabbed at the glowing peat in the hearth. Sparks flew upward, briefly illuminating the stark, shadow-drenched walls of her small sanctuary. She listened to the sounds emanating from the mood room, the rustle of wet fabric, the heavy shuddering breaths, a low muttered curse when his elbow struck the wall. It took him nearly 15 minutes. When Arthur finally emerged, Nora was sitting in her wing-back chair, nursing her lukewarm tea. He paused in the doorway. The Duke of Somerset, a man whose sartorial elegance was written about in the London papers, stood clad in a shepherd's discarded wool. The trousers were too short, revealing his bare, pale ankles and raw red feet. The flannel shirt hung off his broad shoulders, the rough collar chafing his neck. His blonde hair, usually immaculate, was drying in chaotic, salty spikes. He looked ridiculous. He looked entirely human. Arthur shuffled toward the hearth. His joints popped audibly in the quiet room. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the small glowing mound of peat. He practically collapsed onto the small wooden stool positioned near the hearth, hunching forward, extending his raw, trembling hands toward the heat. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, smelling of burning earth and the unmistakable odor of wet, unwashed wool coming from his borrowed clothes. Nora watched the heat slowly bring color back to his skin. It wasn't a gentle flush. It was an angry, mottled red. As his nerve endings thawed, the pain of the cold retreating became obvious. Arthur winced, pulling his hands back slightly, rubbing his knuckles. The chill blades would ache for days. Here, Nora leaned forward and set a tin cup on the small table beside him. Steam rose from it. Arthur grasped the cup with both hands, letting the hot tin burn his palms. He brought it to his lips and took a greedy swallow. He instantly coughed, gagging slightly. "What is this?" he wheezed, his voice scraped raw by the cold. "Broth," Nora replied calmly, "made from root vegetables and marrow bone." "It is what I have." Arthur stared at the murky liquid. It tasted faintly of dirt and old salt. He was accustomed to clear consumes, to rich, dark gravies and roasted meats. He swallowed his pride and then slowly swallowed the rest of the broth. The heat hit his empty stomach like a stone, heavy and grounding. He set the tin cup down. The trembling in his shoulders was subsiding, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He finally turned his head to look at her. She was sitting in the shadows, her grey woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her. She didn't look like his duchess. The diamonds were gone, replaced by the faint, bruised circles of fatigue under her eyes. Yet, she sat with a rigid, unbroken posture. She was entirely self-contained. She didn't need him to fill the silence. She didn't need him at all. "You live like this," Arthur stated. It wasn't a question, it was a bleak observation. "I live," Nora corrected simply. Arthur shook his head. A slow, confused movement. "It is a who, Nora. It smells of damp. The wind cuts right through the walls. You are the daughter of an earl. You were the Duchess of Somerset. You belong in a palace, not scrubbing your own floors like a scullery maid." "I find I prefer scrubbing my own floors," she said, picking up her mending basket. She drew out the needle. "The dirt washes away quite easily. It doesn't follow you from room to room, demanding you apologize for it." The barb landed. Arthur flinched, turning his gaze back to the fire. The peat hissed, a low spitting sound. He was warm now, but the chill in his chest remained heavy and dense. He had breached the fortress. He was inside. But looking at the woman calmly threading a bone needle in the dim light, he realized the terrifying truth. He was inside the cottage, but he was locked out of her entirely. Rain continued to batter the glass, a relentless percussion that underscored the heavy, suffocating quiet of the parlor. The cheap tin clock on the mantel ticked, a loud, hollow sound that seemed to measure the distance growing between them with every passing second. Arthur rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. The rough wool of the shepherd's shirt scratched harshly against his skin. The physical discomfort was maddening, but it was nothing compared to the violent twisting knot of anxiety in his gut. He needed to fix this. He was a man who solved problems with authority and capital. He threw money at inconveniences until they disappeared. He threw titles and influence at scandals until they dissolved. He lowered his hands and straightened his spine, attempting to summon the ghosts of his aristocratic authority, despite the absurd trousers clinging to his calves. "Let us stop this nonsense, Nora," Arthur said, his voice attempting a firm, reasonable cadence. "You have punished me. I froze on your stoop. I am sitting in rags, drinking peasant slop. You have exacted your pound of flesh. It is time to come home. Nora didn't look up from her mending. The bone needle slipped through the grey wool. In, out, pull tight. I am home, Arthur. Do not be deliberately obtuse, he snapped, a flash of his old temper sparking to life. I am talking about London. I am talking about Somerset House. I am talking about your life. My life is here, she replied, cutting the thread with a small pair of iron shears. The snip was loud in the quiet room. Arthur stood up. The small wooden stool rocked precariously behind him. He paced the short length of the hearth, his large frame making the small parlour feel instantly claustrophobic. Is it the allowance? He demanded, running a hand through his stiff, drying hair. I know you haven't touched the stipend. Abernathy told me. If it isn't enough, tell me. I will double it, triple it. I will settle the Cornwall estate on you independently. You can have your own income. You will never have to ask me for a penny. Nora placed her mending basket on the table. She finally looked up at him. Her dark eyes were entirely devoid of anger. They were devoid of anything. They were just flat, dark mirrors reflecting the firelight. Keep your money, Arthur. I have no use for it. He stopped pacing. He stared at her genuinely entirely baffled. Then what is it? Is it Beatrice? He choked slightly on the name. Beatrice, his current mistress, the opera singer with the loud laugh and the expensive tastes. Because if it is, Arthur rushed on, eager to offer a tangible sacrifice. I have already ended. The day you left, I cut her off. I swear it to you, Nora. There will be no more indiscretions, no more public humiliations. I will be the model of a faithful husband. He looked at her expectantly, waiting for the softening of her features. He waited for the tearful relief, the validation that his fidelity was the ultimate prize she had been holding out for. Nora sighed. It was a long, tired sound. She pushed herself up from the wing-back chair and walked over to the small, cracked window. She looked out into the pitch-black night, watching the sleep bounce off the glass. You think this is about Beatrice? She murmured, her breath fogging the cold pain. Or the one before her, the widow in Bath, or the French dancer. Arthur opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words withered on his tongue. It isn't about the women, Arthur, she said, turning her back to the window to face him. The women were just a symptom. A loud, gaudy symptom of the actual disease. Then tell me what the disease is, he shouted, the frustration finally boiling over. He took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Tell me what crime I committed that was so unforgivable you would rather freeze in a well than sleep in a silk bed. Nora didn't flinch. She held her ground. You erased me. The words were spoken quietly, but they hit the room with the force of an anvil. Arthur stopped, his brow furrowing in deep, painful confusion. What? You didn't break my heart, Arthur, Nora said, her voice terrifyingly calm. A broken heart implies passion. It implies a struggle. You didn't give me enough to struggle against. You simply bored me to death. Arthur reeled back as if she had slapped him. Bored you? I was a piece of furniture, she continued, taking a slow step toward him. I was an accessory you wore when the season required it. When you walked into a room, you didn't look at me. You looked past me, checking to see if the china was arranged correctly, if the guests were impressed by my gown. I wasn't a wife. I was the curator of your vanity. That isn't true. I provided you provided a cage, she interrupted, her voice finally raising a fraction, the raw edge of her buried grief showing through the cracks. A beautiful, gilded, suffocating cage. You dictated when I slept, when I ate, who I spoke to, how loudly I laughed. If I was sad, I was an inconvenience. If I was angry, I was hysterical. I shrank myself, Arthur. I chipped away at my own bones just to fit into the tiny, silent space you allotted me in your life. She stopped a few feet from him. The smell of his cheap, damp wool hung between them. I sat in that massive house surrounded by 200 servants, and I realized I had not had a single genuine thought of my own in 3 years. I was disappearing, and you were perfectly content to watch me fade so long as I didn't ruin the upholstery. Arthur stared down at her. His chest heaved. He wanted to scream. He wanted to call her a liar. He wanted to list all the jewels he had bought her, the carriages, the status he had bestowed upon her name, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. He remembered the way she used to smile when they first met, a wide, bright, unguarded thing. He remembered how slowly over the years that smile had tightened into a polite closed line. He remembered walking into the drawing room and ignoring her to read his mail. He remembered her absolute haunting silence in the carriage rides home from parties where he had openly flirted with other women. He hadn't been malicious. It was worse than that. He had been indifferent. "Nora," he whispered, the sound cracking down the middle. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," she said, her voice dropping back to that flat, terrifying calm. "That is exactly why I had to leave." A man who beats his wife knows he is hurting her. A man who ignores her truly believes he is doing her a favor. She walked past him, moving back toward the kitchen. "The storm will break by morning," she said over her shoulder, dismissing him completely. "You can sleep on the sofa. I will walk to the village at dawn and hire a car to take you back to your carriage. Do not come upstairs." Arthur stood frozen by the dying fire. He watched her disappear into the dark stairwell. The floorboards creaked overhead, tracking her steps until she reached her room. A door clicked shut. A bolt slid into place. He was alone in the parlor. He looked at the rough woolen sleeve of his borrowed shirt. He looked at the chipped tin cup on the table. The Duke of Somerset, a man who possessed vast estates, ancient titles, and unimaginable wealth, sank slowly to his knees on the braided rag rug. He buried his face in his raw, trembling hands, and for the first time since he was a small boy, he wept. The sound was ugly, a harsh, jagged tearing in the quiet room. No one came to comfort him. Morning broke over the moors, not with a burst of golden light, but with a slow, creeping greyness that seeped through the cracks in the window frames. Arthur woke to a vicious cramp in his neck. He lay still on the narrow, lumpy sofa, staring at the raw wooden beams of the ceiling. The parlor was freezing. The peat fire had burned down to a pile of fine white ash, smelling of stoke and damp stone. Every joint in his body acted with a dull, throbbing intensity. His feet, tucked under the scratchy wool blanket, felt like blocks of ice. He didn't move for a long time. He simply lay there, letting the crushing reality of the previous night settle over him like dirt on a coffin. "You erased me." The words echoed in the quiet room, louder than the wind outside. He squeezed his eyes shut, but he couldn't block out the image of Nora standing in the dim light, her voice stripped of all anger, leaving only that terrifying hollow truth. He had spent his entire life commanding attention. He demanded loyalty. He demanded perfection. He had never once stopped to consider what it cost the people providing it. A sharp rhythmic sound cut through his thoughts. Thwack, pause, thwack. Arthur slowly pushed himself up. The rough shepherd's shirt chafed against his collarbone. He swung his stiff legs off the sofa and walked to the small window, his bare feet recoiling from the freezing floorboards. Outside, the sleet had stopped, leaving a heavy frost over the dead moor grass. Nora was in the small yard beside the cottage. She was wearing her thick grey coat, a wool scarf wrapped tightly over her hair. In her gloved hands, she held an ironwood axe. She swung it down. The blade bit into a thick log of pine. It didn't split on the first strike. She wrenched the axe free, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and swung again. This time, the wood cracked open with a sharp snap. Arthur watched her, his stomach twisting into a tight, sickening knot. His Duchess, the woman who had worn the Somerset sapphires at the king's coronation, now wrestling with damp pine just to keep from freezing to death. And she preferred this. She preferred the blistering labor to sharing his bed. He turned away from the window. He walked into the mudroom and found his boots. They were still damp, stiff, and freezing. He forced his bruised feet into them, wincing as the cold leather bit into his blisters. He didn't bother with the ruined greatcoat. He stepped out the back door. The air hit him like a physical blow, shocking his lungs. Nora paused mid-swing, the axe hovering above her shoulder. She looked at him. She didn't look surprised. She just looked tired. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and a smudge of dirt streaked across her left cheekbone. Arthur didn't say a word. He walked over to the chopping block, his legs stiff and clumsy. He bent down and picked up the two halves of the split log. The bark was rough, covered in freezing dew. He carried them to the small wicker basket sitting by the kitchen door and dropped them in. Nora lowered the axe. "What are you doing gathering?" Arthur rasped. His throat was entirely raw. "You don't have gloves. You'll splinter your hands." He looked down at his pale, manicured hands. They were already shaking from the cold. He looked back up at her. "Does it matter?" It was a genuine question. The absolute lack of arrogance in his voice made Nora pause. She stared at him. He looked ragged, broken, stripped of all the terrifying authority that had defined him for 3 years. He was just a cold man in borrowed clothes. She didn't tell him to stop. She turned back to the chopping block, set a new log on end and raised the axe. Thack. Arthur picked up the pieces. They worked in absolute silence for 20 minutes. The only sounds were the harsh bite of the axe, the scrape of wood against wood, and their heavy breathing in the frosted air. Arthur's hands were scraped raw, a large splinter deeply embedded in his thumb, bleeding a slow trickle of dark red down his wrist. He didn't complain. He didn't stop. He carried every piece of wood she cut until the basket was overflowing. When she finally set the axe down, leaning heavily against the handle, Arthur was standing by the door, his chest heaving. "The farmer from the neighboring property passes by the crossroads at 8 every morning," Nora said, her voice devoid of inflection. She didn't look at his bleeding hand. She couldn't afford to care. "He takes his milk to the village. I left a silver shilling under a rock by the post yesterday. He will bring his cart here." Arthur swallowed hard. The sound was audible in the quiet morning. "To take me away?" "Yes," he nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. "I will go put my coat on." The cart smelled of sour milk, wet straw, and horse sweat. It rattled violently as it pulled up to the front stoop, the wooden wheels grinding against the frozen mud. The farmer, a thick-set man with a weather-beaten face, didn't climb down. He simply pulled his heavy wool cap lower over his ears and waited, ignoring the tension radiating from the tiny stone cottage. Inside, Arthur stood in the narrow entryway. He was back in his own clothes. The tailored jacket was hopelessly wrinkled and stained with dried mud. His cravat was gone, leaving his neck exposed. He had folded the shepherd's trousers and shirt into a perfectly neat, precise square and left them on the sofa. It took him 10 minutes to get the corners exactly right. It was a pathetic, obsessive attempt to leave something in order. Nora stood by the kitchen door, her arms crossed tight against her ribs. Arthur turned to face her. His hand was on the brass latch. He did not ask her to come with him. He did not offer her money or estates or promises of fidelity. The long, freezing night had burned those delusions away. "I am going to Scotland," Arthur said quietly. His voice sounded hollow, echoing slightly in the small space. "To the hunting lodge in the Highlands. I don't think I can return to London, not to that house." Nora didn't reply. She watched the way his hand gripped the latch. His knuckles were white, the dried blood from the splinter dark against his pale skin. "You were right," he continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes. It took every ounce of his remaining strength to look directly into the void he had created. "I didn't break your heart. I didn't even know it was there. I treated you like a fixture, a very beautiful, very quiet fixture." He let out a shaky breath, his broad shoulders slumping under the ruined wool of his coat. "I cannot undo it," he whispered. "I cannot unsign the paper. I cannot give you back the 3 years I stole from you while I was busy looking at my own reflection." Nora's throat tightened. A strange, heavy pressure built behind her sternum. It wasn't forgiveness. It was too soon, too raw for forgiveness. But it was an acknowledgement. For the first time since the day they met, he was actually seeing her. He was seeing the damage, not the veneer. "No," Nora said softly. "You can't." Arthur nodded, accepting the sentence. He didn't beg for mercy. "Abnethy will send the deeds to the Cornwall estate to you next week," Arthur said. He held up a hand before she could protest. Do not refuse it, Nora. Sell it. Burn it to the ground. Give the land to the tenants. Do whatever you wish with it, but you will take it. Not as an apology, as reparations. He didn't wait for her to agree. He turned the handle and pulled the door open. The biting morning air rushed in, smelling of frost and manure from the cart. He stepped out onto the stoop. He stopped, his back to her, standing in the exact spot where he had frozen in the sleet hours before. Slowly, Arthur turned back around. He did not step inside. He stood on the muddy stone. He looked at her, standing in her faded dress in her freezing, draughty cottage, looking more regal than she ever had sitting on a velvet throne in his dining room. Then the Duke of Somerset bowed. It was not a polite nod. It was not a courtly dip of the shoulders. He bent at the waist, a deep, profound bow of absolute subservience. He held it for 3 long seconds. When he straightened up, his eyes were wet, but he didn't wipe them. Goodbye, Elena, he said. He turned, walked to the filthy wooden cart, and climbed into the back, sitting heavily on a pile of damp straw. He didn't look back. The farmer clicked his tongue, cracked a leather whip, and the horse lurched forward. Nora stood in the doorway. She watched the cart rattle down the muddy, frozen lane, disappearing slowly into the grey morning mist. The sound of the wheels faded, leaving only the sound of the wind whipping across the moors. She stepped back inside and closed the door. She pushed the heavy iron bolt into place. Clack! The cottage was silent again, but the silence felt different today. It didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like a void waiting to be filled. Nora walked into the parlour. She looked at the perfectly folded pile of rough wool on the sofa. She reached up and touched her own cheek. Her fingers came away wet. A single tear, hot and unbidden, had finally fallen. She didn't wipe it away. She let it trace a slow path down her jaw, tasting the salt on her lips. She didn't weep for the Duke of Somerset. She wept for the girl who had tried so hard to be perfect for him. And she wept in profound, agonizing relief that that girl was finally entirely dead. Nora turned, walked into her kitchen, and put the kettle on the fire. Did Nora make the right choice by letting him go? Or do you think Arthur deserves a second chance after finally seeing the truth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this raw emotional journey kept you hooked, hit that like button and share it with a friend who loves a deeply grounded romance drama. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story, where we dive into even more heart-wrenching tales of love, betrayal, and finding your own power. See you in the next.